Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will be starting the webinar officially in 3 minutes at 2:35 as everyone else responds to their calendar notification and trickles into the call. So just give us 3 minutes and we will get the ball rolling. Thanks. In the meantime, please let us know where you're joining us from. Feel free to introduce yourselves, your name, what country you're joining from, what organization you're representing. We just want to know who you are. I am Tepiso Masilunyane. I'm a Sustainable Finance Coordinator for Botswana here at the Sustainable Finance Coalition, and I'll be taking you through today's journey on this webinar. So feel free to head on over to the chat. Let us know who you are and where you're joining us from. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance in Practice webinar series. Today's webinar is the second of a four-part webinar series that has been designed to support members of the SADC TFCA community of practice on sustainable finance to uncover how finance solutions work in real settings. And we use practitioner insights. We center practical case examples, and we really try to drive discourse on how sustainable finance solutions and different sustainable finance solutions are relevant for connected naturescapes. My name is Tepiso Masilunyane, Sustainable Finance Coordinator here at the Coalition. I'm based in Botswana. And helping us today on this conversation on conservation trust funds in practice will be our Head of Regional Coordination here at the Coalition, Chanda Mwale, Rowan Leroux, who's a Senior Sustainable Finance Coordinator here at the Coalition. And we'll also hear from Ernesto Schauke, who is the Monitoring and Evaluation Manager at Biofin, to give us a bit of an in-practice perspective on what running and operating a CTF looks like. If you haven't already, as we're waiting for a few more people to join in, please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, what country you're joining us from, and what organization you're representing. We'd really like to know a little bit about you. As you all do that, I'll just share a little bit about the coalition. With the plethora of finance solutions that are available for financing conservation, our work here at the Coalition really centers on helping different partners working in conservation landscapes find the right finance solutions that fit the right landscapes and that reflect their own operational contexts. We walk shoulder to shoulder with them to unlock sustainable finance that actually achieves impact at scale. But because we need as many organizations and as many teams as possible designing tailor-made finance solutions for the contexts at landscape level, we take an all-hands-on-deck approach. So simply put, we can no longer rely on small projects, limited capacities and skill sets, and a few service providers to plug the finance gap. And so we use two keys to essentially unlock the power of impact at scale at the coalition. And the first is what we call the finance model, which is an approach we use to ensure that partners are able to find the right finance solutions and avoid wasting, time and resources on options that eventually might not turn up to be viable. We also, through the finance model, make sure that they design these solutions effectively to get them to where actual flows of finance is generated and to be able to mobilize the resources and the social capital that they need to practically build new finance solutions. And we really rely on the second key to take this work forward, nature finance doers. And these are the ecosystem of partners that we walk shoulder to shoulder with in this journey, supporting them in finding and in designing and in scaling sustainable finance solutions. And this is the approach that we take, the finance model, to unlock finance for nature with our partners, find, design, and mobilize. We find the right finance solution for a given context, design it within very clear impact parameters, working with the right stakeholders that are fit for a particular kind of finance solution. And we mobilize the financial resources as well as the social capital, the expertise that are necessary to implement finance solutions at scale. And so that's the journey that we take with our doer partners to take this work forward. And this ecosystem includes partners from government agencies to community-led conservation entities, development institutions, and on the private sector end, we work with financial institutions from sectors ranging from banking to insurance to wealth management to bring all the expertise across the landscape to deliver impact at scale. And it is that ecosystem that has allowed us to scale sustainable finance across 15 countries on the continent. We are currently working with 4 transfrontier conservation areas and 14 other partners to deliver sustainable finance to conservation needs in different landscapes across the continent. And today's webinar is essentially part of a webinar series that sits within the Sustainable Finance Coordination and Capacity for TFCA's project, which is a SADC initiative with support from the Joint Action Natura Africa CNRM program that's co-funded by the European Union and the German government. All right, now we can take a quick look at what to expect from today's session. Chanda will open today's session for us with a few remarks to get us into, good framing. And then we'll move into the core of today's session with Rowan, who will take us through a technical framing on conservation trust funds, what they are, what they're not, and the right building blocks that are needed to design them when the context fits. We'll then have a fireside chat with Ernesto from BioFund for our in-practice segment before we open for questions from the audience. So before then, let's get into quick rules and set the ground rules for today's session. We hope to have a productive and respectful conversation. So to achieve that, please be sure to maintain your mic. All participant mics are on mute, so please raise your hand in the case that you would like to contribute verbally. There will be opportunities for the floor to contribute verbally. But in the meantime, please use the chat to engage, to comment, to ask your questions. We will have a Q&A segment later on during the session. But when we do, let's keep the chat respectful and let's keep our questions and our reflections relevant to the conversation. In the case that you are given an opportunity to unmute your mic and engage, please keep your contributions brief and let's keep them on topic. Right, quick icebreaker before we get into the meat of things. What stage best describes your experience with conservation trust funds? So you want to know where you're at with your understanding or your engagement on the issue of conservation trust funds. So right now, please, if you're on your phone, feel free to head on over to your camera and there will be a QR code on your screen. Just scan it or head on over to your browser and go to slido.com and enter the code on your screen. The code should be 3606618. That's 3606618. The question is, what stage best describes your experience with CTFs? You might be new to the concept of CTFs and you're really trying to understand what the buzz about CTFs is. Some of you might be curious, CTFs, you're curious and you'd like to explore and know more about conservation trust funds. But some of you might have some exposure to CTFs and just want to further and be part of the conversation around them. We know that some of you in your landscapes might be currently looking at potentially designing or building a conservation trust fund within your landscape. And some of you might currently be implementing a conservation trust fund or working with or for a conservation trust fund. So we just want to get a picture of who's joining us today. I think, a lot of us looks like we are new to the concept of CTFs. Some are curious but exploring, with a few already implementing actually, and some looking at designing a CTF. I think I'll give more people a chance to reply. What stage best describes where you're at and your experience with conservation trust funds? All right, if you're still looking at responding, just go to slido.com on your browser and enter the code or scan the QR code on your screen. You can continue to respond, but I think it's very clear a lot of us are new to the concept of CTFs, and a lot of us actually are working in conservation landscapes, delivering important sustainable finance work and conservation work in landscapes. And the conversation we're hoping to have today, we hope will be valuable and deliver, valuable insights for those of you that are still curious, still exploring, but also those of you who are currently looking at implementing. For those of you already implementing, we hope the conversation provides some sort of, guidance on what makes credible, up to standard conservation trust fund work. All right, to kick us off in that conversation, let's welcome our Head of Regional Coordination here at the Coalition, Chanda Mwale, for welcome remarks. Chanda, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Sapito. I hope I am audible. I trust that I am audible. Welcome, everybody, to our second webinar discussing sustainable finance in practice, with a particular focus on supporting TFCAs within the SADC region. A special thanks to our donors and partners, the EU, GIZ, SADC, and several other partners who have made this webinar possible. My task this afternoon is really quite brief, as many government personnel would say. Maintaining all protocols. Good afternoon, everybody. The purpose of this webinar really is to interrogate CTFs, CTFs have been around, conservation trust funds have been around since the early 90s. I think one of the first that was put together was in Mexico. And it is one of the most popular conservation trust funds around, soon after the Rio conference in 1992. There have been several proliferations of this, I believe over 100 in nearly 80 countries around the world. But what does this mean for us here in Africa, on the continent, but also contextualizing this through TFCAs? We know and understand that TFCAs are critical for connectivity on the continent, but also integrated sustainable development. We have, across many countries and these critical landscapes, biodiversity that is unmatched, but also we need to ensure that livelihoods are maintained, food security is met, climate resilience, as well as adaptation and mitigation measures, and everything else that needs to happen in TFCAs. We also understand that conservation trust funds can help us ensure sustainable flows of finance within these landscapes if done properly. A lot of the conversation today will look into why CTFs exist, how they can work, where they work best, and some of the key pitfalls and risks. And Rowan will talk us through a lot of the practicalities of this. And Ernesto will help us land CTFs within the continent and in specific context, Mozambique, where the Biofund has been in existence for quite a while. We do hope that this afternoon session will be useful for all of us. There'll be many lessons learned. And as Tsepiso mentioned, please ensure that you share any reflections or comments that you might have in the chat whilst we get through the webinar and we have our speakers done. At the Coalition, we're excited for this kind of work because, as Tsepiso mentioned, we find, design, and mobilize sustainable finance solutions across the continent, not just the landscapes, but also seascapes. And so we are very excited to have these roll out in as many landscapes as possible on the continent, but ensuring that they are grounded in viability and they are also fit for purpose, which are some of the things that will be unpacked this afternoon. So looking forward to the conversation. Many thanks for this privilege as a Sustainable Finance Coalition to have this knowledge exchange and for you taking the time to be with us. And back to you, Tsepiso, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Chanda. I think that sets us in a very good direction. With that, very quickly, I'd like to call on Rowan Leroux, who's a Senior Sustainable Finance Coordinator here in the Coalition, to take us through a technical framing of CTFs. What are they? How do they work? And where might they fall short? Rowan, over to you.
Thank you, Tsepiso. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen and just take over now. Please indicate if you can see my screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Tsitsipo. Thank you, Chanda, for the introductions. And good afternoon, everybody. Let's get straight in and start with the most basic question. Why do conservation trust funds exist at all? To answer that, we have to start with the money problem that sits underneath everything in African conservation. Across Africa, available funding for protected area management covers only 10 to 20% of what those areas actually need to operate. That's an IUCN assessment and has been remarkably stable. 80% of the funding need on average is simply not there. Everything we talk about today flows from that gap. Now, traditional donor funding tries to fill some of that gap, and it does important work, but it has 4 structural weaknesses we should be honest about. It's project-based and short-term, typically 3 to 5 years. It builds institutional dependency rather than financial resilience. Priorities can shift with donor politics, not with the conservation need. And when funding stops, programs often collapse. And that's the world CTFs are designed to push back against. So what is a CTF? The CFA's definition is the cleanest one. Private, legally independent institution that provides sustainable financing for biodiversity conservation. The key idea is permanence. You build an institution that holds capital for the long term and channels it as grants to conservation work on the ground. It's a structural answer to a structural problem. So before we go further, I'd just like to have two key reflections. And I'll be posting these reflections throughout the webinar for you to sit with and think about, and maybe ask questions in the chat or later in the seminar. So the questions are, how stable is your own funding over a 5-year horizon? And have you experienced a program collapse or near collapse because of a funding gap? I think many people experienced similar or high risk over the COVID period. And so that was one time where CTFs could have stepped into the gap. So now that we know a CTF exists, let's get into the mechanics of how they actually work. So the core things we're going to fund are fund types, governance, and then the standards framework that wraps around all of it. There are 3 fund types, and most mature CTFs eventually run a combination of these 3. You have an endowment fund, which invests capital and spends only the returns, So the interest earned or the return on that capital. The capital base itself is preserved into perpetuity. You have sinking funds, where a fund draws capital down over a defined period, useful for time-bound objectives, but the money does eventually come to an end. A revolving fund. This is where the money is dispersed and replenished from ongoing revenue streams. So in these scenarios is where you've got a revenue stream such as tourism levies or conservation fees that can replenish the fund over time. Endowments are the most common. Sinking funds are the most flexible, and revolving funds usually sit alongside the other 2. So independence is a defining feature of a well-run CTF. The CFA practice standards are clear. Government should have a seat at the table. It has to align with national priorities. But government must remain a minority voice. Majority government control creates political vulnerability and undermines donor confidence. A typical board mixes government, civil society, communities, independent experts, and sometimes the private sector. So if I leave you with one key component in this webinar today, it's this slide. I really want you to understand and remember these 7 building blocks. So the CFA practices standards organize CTF operations into 7 core areas, the key building blocks. These map directly to the Sustainable Finance Coalition's building blocks of governance. And you can see that I've highlighted robust governance as an extremely important. It's number 1. Institutional effectiveness, programmatic alignment, effective administration, asset management, risk management, and safeguards and resource mobilizations. So these standards are voluntary, but they have become the de facto benchmark donors use to assess CTFs. If you take one framework away from today, take this one. Build your CTFs around this framework, and you're more likely to succeed than not. So from reflections, how familiar is your board or leadership team with the CFA practice standards? And have you ever used them for self-assessment? Who currently sits on your governance structure? Does government have majority influence? Are there a seat at the table guiding and being part of the decisions? How is that all set up? So where do CTFs work best? CTFs are not the right tool in every situation. There are 6 conditions that the evidence suggests need to be in place for them to be successful. So these 6 conditions are a clear defined conservation mandate. Broad mandates add complexity without adding impact. It's critical that the mandate and the conservation mandate be clear, well-defined. Government endorsement without government control. So going back to the governance issue and the seat at the table, government must be part of the decision making. They must be involved and be at the table, but they should not have government control. A credible legal and regulatory environment, including tax exemptions and protection from expropriation. So ensuring that the structure is sound for continuity and permanence and perpetuity. Adequate capitalization. There's no magic number, but endowments below $10 million often struggle. And we'll discuss this more later as some of the risks. A strong local civil society to act as grantees. A CTF is only as good as the organizations it funds. And we'll highlight a little bit later what CTFs aren't and what they are. And long-term donor commitment, because these things take a decade to reach maturity. These are not short-term fixes. We need people to be in for the long term, patient capital as it's often referred to. Some reflections. Does your context meet these conditions? Which ones are perhaps weak or missing? What would it take specifically in your context to get a CTF to the point where it could function independently as an institution on its own? So CTFs, so the conversation that often gets skipped, and it's quite an important one. A CTF is a financial mechanism. It manages and distributes money. There are real things it cannot do, and we need to be honest about them. So the 5 things a CTF cannot do. It cannot fix governance failure in the park or area under conservation itself. If the conservation authority is corrupt or politically captured, better governance at the fund level won't reach the ground. It cannot replace a missing conservation strategy. It cannot substitute for political will, and it cannot be set up quickly. It needs 5 to 10 years to be realistic. And it cannot operate on a shoestring. The administration costs and real and underfund are real, And underfunding them is how funds fail quietly over time. They're almost just like it's a death by 1,000 cuts is when CTFs are underfunded. And I would like to add another one inside here, is implementing partners. If you don't have sufficient implementing partners on the ground to disperse the money and to implement the money that they've been received, the CTF cannot fix that. So 2 specific risks, and it's worth sort of naming around CTFs, just to be very clear. The substitution effect. Often we see that the CTF is seen as filling the gap that other organizations were previously filling, specifically governments. And they may feel less pressure to maintain their own conservation budgets or continuing to make donations. Good design includes co-contribution conditions to guard against this. So be careful of substitution, or for those who know in the credit market, for leakage, where the CTF just substitutes for existing funding and the net pool doesn't actually improve. And then the scale effect. A single CTF serving one park may never accumulate enough capital to be viable. Individual funds that can't reach scale may be better off joining a shared platform than going it alone. Don't believe that every area, every polygon of land requires its own CTF. There are a lot of opportunities to work together, create platforms, and co-create a CTF that can cover many conservation areas. So some key reflections to leave you on that section. What problem are you actually trying to solve? And is a CTF the right tool for it, or just the most familiar one? Does what the CTF can do, it's a financial institution that distributes finance, meet your expectations of what you require to be achieved? And what is realistic capitalization target? Where would the capital come from? And the last one is quite a big issue. If you only need 2 or 3 million rand or dollars or Namibian dollars, or the likelihood of a CTF being financially viable in its own right is very low and might not be the best mechanism to do that. So every key pitfalls and risks, even well-designed CTFs face significant risks. I want to walk through the 4 key categories of failure we see most often, so that when we discuss your context, you have a framework for what to look for. The 4 key areas of a well-designed CTF that fail in predictable ways is where there are governance failures. These show up as board capture by a single stakeholder, most often government or a dominant donor. So government is not always the only one at risk. A dominant donor could also result in board capture. Or is a weak conflict of interest management, or is inadequate financial skills on the board. So governance, we go back to the previous slides where we put governance as the big building block. governance and CTFs are really, really critical and core. Financial risk in Africa is acute. Currency mismatch between hard currency endowments and local currency operations, returns below the rate of spending plus inflation, and over-concentration in a single asset class. This goes to the asset management risk of conservation trust funds and why they incur significant costs to be managed. Operationally, high overhead relative to grant making, weak monitoring and evaluation, and skills gaps in smaller funds, as well as the cost to run these, the CTF relative to its capitalization base. And in the context of Africa, political instability, limited local capital markets, access to capital markets in the countries that these CTFs are developed, resulting in the capital sitting offshore, as in the endowment components, and weak local grantee ecosystems, going back to the point of who actually implements these systems. So which of these risk categories is most relevant to your context? And what safeguards would you put in place to protect against board capture, specifically in your political environment? The Africa picture. So let's zoom out and look at the African Conservation Trust Fund landscape. What exists, what the gap is, and where things are going. So these are the Consortium of African Funds for the Environment, the CAFE numbers. 19 member funds across 22 countries supporting over 95 parks and reserves and 125 communal conservancies. Together they manage over $550 million in endowments, plus about 120 million in sinking funds. There's a real functioning African CTF community. The institutional knowledge really does exist. 5 funds worth knowing about by name, and we have the privilege of having BioFund with us for our fireside chat later, one of the founding CAFE members. The CCFN in Namibia, supporting communal conservancies, an area where I work, and most recently the Project for Permanence Fund, also a CTF set up in Namibia. EAM-CEF in Tanzania, focused on the Eastern Arc Mountains. FTNS in Cameroon, a transboundary fund covering the Congo Basin Tri-Nation area, and BACOMAB in Mauritania, a marine and coastal fund with active private sector work underway. All with different models, different scales, all operating. So despite the progress, this gap is still enormous. Most protected areas on the continent have no access to a CTF. We're back at the 10 to 20% number from the start. The Pan-African Conservation Trust, APAC, launched in 2022 by AWF and CAFE, is an attempt to address scale through a hybrid mechanism, an endowment, a sinking fund component, and a private investment element. Watch this space to see that sufficient capitalized takes place, and we could have a very successful hybrid CTF. So almost 3 reflections before my section comes to an end. Are there existing CTFs in your region you could engage with or contribute to rather than starting a new one? I think that's a fundamental question that we always need to raise. I often get asked, we need to create a CTF, and we look at the building blocks. And one of the key critical areas is the capitalization of the fund and the size of the organizations to manage it. And we often fall short in that area. But are there opportunities to consolidate or join an existing CTF? What role should the private sector play and what barriers exist to that engagement? CTFs are often funded, capitalized by philanthropic money. How do we bring in private sector money? How do we ensure that that money is utilized for conservation and nature, but the private individuals or organizations that put that money in to capitalize these CTFs receive the recognition and the returns that they're looking for? And I'm not talking financial returns, I'm talking impact returns, opportunities for them to contribute. And given the current funding environment, what is a realistic pathway to capitalizing a new CTF in your context? What access to philanthropic money, what access to private individuals, high net worths, to people who are looking to preserve their legacy going forward in an endowment or a well-structured CTF that will last well into the future? And so to close, just a thought before we move on to our fireside chat, which I'm really looking forward to. The purpose of this conversation is to encourage interest in CTFs. They are legitimate, valuable tools with a strong track record where conditions are right. We want to ensure that enthusiasm for the model is grounded in a realistic understanding of what it takes to make one work and what it cannot do on its own. The best outcome from today is that we all leave with sharper questions than we walked in with. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you, and I yield the floor back to you, Mr. Tsepiso.
Thank you very much, Rowan, for that presentation. And I hope it was, very illuminating for a lot of us who are still looking to understand what CTFs are, or who are currently looking at building a CTF for our own landscapes. CTFs definitely have great value for unlocking sustainable finance for landscapes across the continent. And from Rowan's presentation, we learned that currently in Africa, CTFs, or at least those that are members of the CAFE network, the CAFE consortium, are managing over $500 million of capital within their funds, with about 120 in sinking funds. And that's important capital that these funds are unlocking for important conservation work in different landscapes across the continent. But that barely scratches the surface of the finance and the scale of finance that is needed to unlock finance for nature on the continent. And we definitely do need to be supporting more long-term sustainable finance and institutional finance vehicles like CTFs to unlock more long-term finance. Thank you so much, Rowan, for those insights. And if you do have questions for Rowan, please leave them in the Q&A section, and we'll circle back to those questions. We will have an opportunity to engage with the floor. So if you have a question, and you'd rather ask it openly, we will have that opportunity later on. For now, I'd like to move on over to our fireside chat with one of those CTFs that were highlighted by Rowan earlier on, and welcome Ernesto. Ernesto has been working at Biofund for approximately, I think, 7 years now. Within the institutional and disbursement program at Biofund. He currently serves as a monitoring and evaluation manager at Biofund, and his work includes supporting the implementation of long-term endowment-funded conservation projects, as well as strategic monitoring, communication, fundraising, environmental awareness, and all the other work that comes with ensuring that money dispersed by Biofund actually achieves impact at scale at the landscape level. Ernesto, welcome.
Thank you, Tsepiso. Wow, what a presentation.
I think I'll be getting a lot more wows after a fireside chat with you. All right, we can get started, Ernesto. And if you could kindly just briefly introduce Biofund. Who is Biofund and what role does it play in Mozambique's conservation finance landscape?
Okay, thank you, Tsepiso, and thank you very much, Rowan, as well, for the very insightful presentation. I'll try not to repeat myself because many of the things that Rowan presented is somehow connected to what we are doing. So to present Biofund, I'll just present the timeline. I think is the best way to understand where Biofund comes from. So in 2006, there was created the informal group that was called Group of Conservation. And in 2008, there was Mozambique held an international Congress on sustainable financing. And at that conference, one of the recommendations was to set a conservation trust fund. So in 2009, the government of Mozambique have approved the conservation policies. And these conservation policies was the instrument that has helped to generate both biofund and ANAC. And this is very important to differentiate because under the same conservation policy, it stated that we needed to establish a national administration to manage the conservation areas, but we needed as well to have a CTF that will help to mobilize and channel funds to conservation. So we have these two different entities. ANAC was created I think it was May in 2011, and Biofund was created later on in November in 2011. So we were formally launched in 2015, and from 2016, we started to disperse funds to the conservation areas. As Rowan mentioned, we are one of the founding members of the CAFE network, and we are part of the board member as well. Today, we have more than 19 members in Biofund that are not people that are directly working with us, but are people and institutions that are playing a very important role in conservation sector in Mozambique, that help Biofund through involvement in some of the governing bodies and specific committees. So today our endowment fund is of about 17 million, and we have a project portfolio of around 150 million. We have been working with 36 conservation areas in Mozambique, and those 36 conservation areas, they cover over 60% of the area that is under some sort of conservation in Mozambique. So in Mozambique, we have 26% of our territory under protection, and Biofund is supporting over 6% of that territory. So in terms of the mission, as Rowan mentioned, our mission is basically to support conservation, sustainable use of natural resources, and the conservation of national system of conservation areas. So we do not manage the conservation areas. We do not implement directly the activities, but we fundraise and we channel funds to conservation through partnership and through all the entities that we work with. Just to finish, in terms of a strategic approach, we have now 4 strategic pillars. The first strategic pillar is finance conservation, which is our core business. And under these strategic pillars, one of the goals is to channel $15 million every year. And another goal is to generate biodiversity knowledge through supporting research, etc. And the second strategic pillar is about fundraising. And our main goal here is to reach $100 million by next year. And we have some objectives as well under this strategic pillar. And we have the third strategic pillar, which is about advocacy and environmental education. And the fourth, which is about an organization that is efficient and sustainable. So, Tsepiso, I'll say that this is a brief presentation of Biofund and of what we do.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. I think that really gives a good picture of the work that Biofund does, and what I think ideally an operational conservation trust fund should look like and be structured towards. I think what I'm getting very clearly from that response, Ernesto, is Biofund as an institution has a very, specific and clear mandate within the conservation landscape. And it's not necessarily to do, the landscape conservation work. Mozambique has a lot of partners on the ground doing the work, but to act as the institutional vehicle to mobilize the finance that is needed at the landscape level and disperse it to where it's needed to support the work on the ground. I think, thank you very much for that. And I think you might have covered actually a bit of my second question, but I wanted you to highlight it a little bit more specifically on what conservation or what financing challenge specifically was Biofund set up to respond to. You mentioned two institutions that are foundational, to conservation governance in Mozambique, ANAC and Biofund. So specifically, what's the conservation or the finance challenge that Biofund as an institution and as a CTF was set up to respond to? And why was a CTF the right vehicle for those currently considering the same approach?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. In terms of challenges, I'll say that most of the African countries will have a very similar challenges, but I'll try to wrap this into 4 groups. The first challenge Rowan has already highlighted, I think, is the financial gap. Conservation sector is still not the priority in Africa or in our countries. We are still focusing on, let's say, health, on education, on security or defense. So we do not have enough money going to conservation. Even on those conservation on those sectors that are priority, we do not have enough funding going there. So in conservation sector is worse. So I'll say that the financial gap is the first challenge. And I think in Mozambique, we have managed to put conservation into national agenda. We have been able to mobilize a very high profile individuals to be engaged in conservation activities. But yeah, it's still not the first priority. And the other challenge, I would say, that are the state administrative procedures, because many times those administrative procedures from the states involve long bureaucratic processes, multiple approval stages, and the mandatory validation from the administrative court. And that may result in the delays on the implementation of activities. So that's why I think this is one of the challenges. And the other one, I'll say that is the balance between conservation and development. And this is a very important challenge because we need development, but we need to, the development must be sustainable. So that means that we have to have conservation going as well. So this is a very great question. So on how to balance conservation and development. And the other challenge that we have is the lack of technical capacity in the system, in the national system of conservation area. In Mozambique, most of the conservation areas are very remote. So we do not have people working in conservation areas. They don't stay longer in the conservation areas. So this is a problem because we do not have the institutional memory and we do not build capacity in the conservation area. So in terms of why Biofund, today I'll answer that. First is that Biofund has proven a track record in obtaining and managing funds. So today we have been able to show that we are capable of fundraising and managing the funds. And we have financial and biodiversity conservation expertise as well. And this is very important to have people that are very well trained on financial management, but as well as biodiversity conservation as well. Because those people, they know where the money is and they know where the needs are as well. And we have simple but very solid administrative procedures, and this helps to overcome the problem that I mentioned on the state administrative procedures. And as Rowan mentioned, we as private and independent entity that is very flexible. We have flexible procedures, flexible ways to fund. I will give some examples on some projects that we have designed within 2 or 3 months, and we were able to disburse within a very short time. So.
Thanks, Ernesto. So very clearly, the role of Biofund as a CTF and what makes it the right vehicle here is that it very clearly has a mandate and a role that it's playing in the conservation landscape, and that's addressing the conservation finance gap specifically. And so as an institution, very clearly, the CTF isn't, just a repository for finance. It doesn't just, host. It's not an account for finance, but very clearly it goes out to mobilize finance and disperse it and manage it. And you've been doing this work, I think, dispersing at least since 2016, you mentioned. So about 10 years now, going into the future. I think that really does tell a incredible story of making sustainable finance actually, sustainable. But from your experience, Ernesto, what have been the most critical building blocks that have made Biofund credible and has made it functionable, in practice? And Rowan mentioned some building blocks earlier. If you were to pick some, which would you say would be, the most key or the most critical to have in mind for institutions or partners right now looking to establish a CTF?
I think, yes, Ron has mentioned, I think, all the building blocks, and his presentation was much fancier than mine. But I'll say that first one is accountability. You have to be you have to have the accountability. But the other one, I'll say that is to have an endowment fund. This is very important to have an endowment fund. As I said, we were officially launched in 2015, but we already had our endowment generating revenues. And here is not only about having an endowment fund, is to have a very good investment policy for endowment. So as Rowan mentioned, you are not supposed to use the capital that you invest. You can use only the revenues. And in our case, we are using 4% of the average of the revenues of the last 5 years. So this is very important because we never use the capital itself. And on the endowment, we have had a very good revenues over the years. Since we started this mechanism, our endowment has generated over $30 million, but we have only used it, I think I will say around 12 or $13 million. So that $20-something billion was invested. So the initial capital and some of the revenues are invested as well. So I think endowment is very important and is one of the building blocks that I would say that all the CTFs must have. The other one I'll say is to try to diversify the source of funding. Rowan mentioned the dependency on donor funding, and this is a very big problem. So you have to try to diversify your source of funding, but not only the source of funding, I'll say the models of funding as well, because donor money is kind of one model. So you have to try to set innovative financial mechanisms as well. In Mozambique, we are working on biodiversity offsets and some mechanism in order to help to build this sustainability. So my colleague Vanda can answer your question on this if you want. The other, yes, I just wanted to mention one. The other building block I'll mention here is the partnership. As Rowan mentioned, as CTFs, you are not expected to do all by yourself. So you have to partner with the government, with the ministries, the governmental agency, with the donors, implementing agencies, academy, etc. You have to partner. So on this, we have found very useful to work with local institution or organization that work directly with conservation areas. So we do not need to be there in daily basis, but we can see the sustainability of the activities that we are funding in conservation areas. So I have a few, two more. Can I mention them?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So the other one I would say is very important to engage the communities as well. As was mentioned previously, it's very important to fund the livelihood community support as well, because in Mozambique, in recent years, we have a very bad examples of how the protected areas are not involving the communities, because when we had the post-electoral protests, the people went to distract the properties that we have in the protected areas. So you have to engage. The people must see the benefit of having conservation areas, because the conservation area, our approach, it has been to protect the biodiversity. We can do that, but we have to try to show the people that the conservation areas are there to promote the sustainable use as well. And lastly, I will say it's very important to not forget to create to enable the environment for conservation areas. So this means you have to involve the civil society, you have to involve all the main actors on conservation.
Thank you, Ron. I think you've mentioned, Ernesto, I think you've mentioned accountability, endowment funding, innovative finance to diversify the sources of funding, partnerships, and stakeholder and community engagement as some of the critical success factors for what has made BioFund successful right now. And I think very quickly, I'm very interested in the innovative finance component, because what you're saying is it's not just an issue having the endowment fund, but perhaps also needing to stack up the revenue sources for the fund itself to make it sustainable. And so CTFs, as they are, might not be a sustainable finance solution. We have to activate, the sustainability of the financial instrument or the financial institution itself. So very quickly for Wanda, if she's there, on the role of innovative finance and strengthening BioFund as a CTF.
Hello again. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vanda. I am Ernesto's colleague. So here in Mozambique, in BioFund in particular, we have been implementing for 10 years now a program named Biodiversity Offsets Program. We basically work on a daily basis with the government. We assist them in order for our country to implement correctly what we called mitigation hierarchy. That it is basically 4 steps that project proponents must implement during their activities, namely to avoid the impacts, minimize the impacts, restore all the areas that suffered degradation, and lastly, to compensate. And this is part of the legal instruments in Mozambique. All the projects that have been categorized as A or A+, namely mining sector, fisheries, oil and gas, agriculture, etc. They must implement this type of projects. So taking into account that our government has limitations in terms of capacity, technical skills, and funds, what we've decided to do, Biofund and also another partner named WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, we have been implementing a larger program named Combo Plus that has been implemented in 6 countries. And together with the other partners, we were able to develop a legal instrument, the ministerial diploma on offsets, that since it was launched or published at 2022. So all the companies, as I mentioned, that are categorized as A or A+, and that cause residual negative impacts into the biodiversity, they must compensate, not in terms of money, but in terms of biodiversity. If you cause degradation, for example, on coral reefs, seagrass meadows, or mangroves, or Mayombo forests, you must compensate for that by restoring the same area that you have degraded on inside conservation areas or etc. So as mentioned by my colleague Ernesto, here in Mozambique, we are addressing limited sustainable finance. So I believe that biodiversity offsets is going to be a promising solution to solve the situation, because the money or the activities on biodiversity offsets are going to be implemented inside conservation areas or inside the key biodiversity areas. So it is a lot other source of finance to our conservation, so that we can meet with conservation goals that were established to Mozambique.
Yeah, and just to quickly compliment Vanda, we have had a feasibility study that shows that the potential of this mechanism is of about 150 million every year. So it's a very important mechanism. And if we can get this mechanism working, I think will be a very important source of funding as well. Just to give you an example, the Brazilian fund, Fundbio, they have the main source of funding for them is the legal obligation, which includes offsets, etc.
Thank you very much, Ernesto and Vanda. The innovative finance solutions, should also be geared up to support the mobilization of the CTF. I want to now, open the floor to questions that have been asked in the Q&A box, Ernesto, and we'll later on give an opportunity for direct questions from the audience. Holly Nell from SafeS asks, with revolving funds, specifically with revolving funds, how do you agree the amount that a park income would go back into the fund rather than into the park's bank account. So that's the question on if there's income coming from the parks into the CTF, how do you negotiate that agreement on what goes to the park, what goes to the CTF? Do you have an arrangement that speaks to this BioFund?
No, at BioFund, we do not have this model working yet, but I have seen in FundBio, they have something like that, but we do not have the experience on this model.
Okay. All right. And another question, do we have any, and this might also go to Rowan if you're still here, Rowan. Do we have any privately influenced CTF in Africa that might have started using assets that belong to private companies and through partnership with the host community? And so I think this is speaking to the role of private finance in CTFs. If you can reflect on that, Ernesto, I'm happy to give it to you. Or Rowan, you can start and then Ernesto can reflect.
Cool, yeah, happy to start. Yeah, I think as I put in the chat a little bit later on, Tsepiso, there's a couple of hybrids. There aren't pure CTFs that have resulted from that structure or that concept at this point. The hybrid that I've put there, the Munyani Conservancy, effectively land was returned to original owners through land restitution. And the original owners then said, we would like to continue to have a conservation and continue to benefit. And then they worked with And Beyond, which is the tourism organization, who then set up and facilitated a CTF-like structure. So it's an endowment, it's got a board, it's got all the rest of it, but it's not a conservation trust fund by the true sense of the nature. So it's a little bit of a hybrid, but it acts and performs in the same way. And it's a collaboration between the private entity, which is And Beyond Tourism, and then the local communities that own the land that was returned to them to benefit from the conservation and tourism efforts on the land. So to answer the question, no, but there are hybrids out there that could be looked at.
All right, thanks, Rowan. And I think maybe Ernesto, with Rowan having covered that question, I want to field this next question to you from Desiree, who says thank you again for the presentation, Ernesto. And they ask, how has been the impact of investments towards meeting the country's biodiversity targets? That's part one. So the impact in meeting the targets, and what kind of financial instruments have you rolled out, and how has private sector appetite been? I think that last part speaks to what Vanda has already highlighted on sustainable finance instruments to support the CTF. But you could maybe touch on the impact component.
Okay. So on the impact component, we have a very structured framework now, and we are, as I said, we have partnership with the government, and we have kind of, and we are very aligned with the national targets. For example, we have an alignment with the NBSAP, which are national biodiversity targets. So, and we are working directly with the government to measure our results in conservation areas. We are using MET assessment. I think some of you might have heard. So that helps to show which impact that we are generating in conservation areas. And we are measuring as well the percentage of I'll say in the indicator species that have their population are stable or increasing. So we have some specific tools to measure that impact in conservation. And we are working with one of the governmental agencies as well to measure the deforestation rate in conservation areas. So we have some tools to measure the social impact, the biodiversity impact, and the management impact as well. So all of that we are doing in alignment with our government. And yeah, we have as well some of impact in advocacy. As I said, we are independent, so we are able to voice our opinions in many of the activities. Let's say, for example, about mining, about destructing the important ecosystems, etc.
All right, incredible. And the last part of this question, Desiree, speaks to what you think the appetite for private sector might be. Does BioFund engage with private sector, and do you think there's a role that private sector can have in supporting CTFs?
Yes, I'll leave this question to Vanda.
Okay.
Okay. Hello again. So inside the biodiversity offsets, the private sector, they are going to play an important role here, because thanks to the projects they are going to implement, they're going to be able to mobilize money, a huge amount of money, to the conservation areas. And more and more, we have been interacting with different project proponents. I'm talking about Kenmar, Total, ExxonMobil, and many others that, due to the nature of their activities, they must do biodiversity offsets management plans in different areas in Mozambique. They're doing mining, oil and gas projects, and etc. So they're going to play an important role here in biodiversity. And more, they must comply with the IFC and other international standards. So they have an obligation on this. So I think that helps to answer your question.
Absolutely, Uvanda. So private sector does have a role, and I know there's stakeholders from the private sector, from the mining sector, seeing that are joining this webinar right now. Thank you for that. I think the next question was, how are host communities' requirements supported and represented through these funds? And how accountable are CTFs to local stewards and landowners, given that the boards, the funders, the managers may seek other skills or serve other agendas? So how do these funds balance their accountability to stewards on the ground and to communities on the ground versus the boards, the funders, the fund managers, etc. And this can go to Rowan or Ernesto. I think maybe Rowan, if you're still there. The question is on balancing community accountability versus the board.
Sure. Yeah, so to answer that one, historically the boards have
Members, managers, etc.
Yeah, the boards. So to answer that simply, so the boards traditionally are quite heavy in terms of NGOs, individual stakeholders, donors, finance experts, and government. And the ability for local communities to access or vote on those boards is quite limited. Traditionally, that has been the case. However, what is the normal and the internationally accepted practices is to define the governance structures and the board requirements in terms of the memorandum of incorporation of the trust, the actual implementation of the endowment. It's all structured to include safeguards around community involvement. So ensuring that IFPIC is implemented, ensuring that certain activities cannot be conducted without the consent of the community, for example. So what the Conservation Trust funds try to do is they try to bring the communities in through the governance level and the governance component by setting up requirements and safeguards that the trust can and cannot do, as opposed to a direct vote. Not to say that communities can't be represented, but normally they don't have a majority vote, which can then be a veto, for example. So it's just a component of balancing that.
All right, thank you. And while I still have you, Rowan, I think this might be the last question from our Q&A. Gulliver asks if I was thinking about establishing a CTF, what would one or two other alternatives be to a CTF? So perhaps looking at funds generally and why they would go for CTFs versus other funds, types of fund structures.
So it's a great question. I think the concept around a CTF is because it's housed traditionally in a trust. It has components that are quite expensive. You need a board, you need certain requirements, you need that trust to be legally registered, etc. So other options are to create an endowment-like structure. So you could create a conservation trust, you could create a conservation facility that has all the same requirements as a conservation trust fund, but might not meet the legal obligation. So there are a few of those. There's one in the Seychelles, where a private tourism operator has an endowment fund that supports environmental activities on the ground for conservation. And that is pretty much meets all of the conservation standards. They just haven't called it a conservation trust fund. It's got an endowment, it's got a board, it's got all the other requirements. And so they've been able to establish that at a much lower cost, and perhaps with one or two areas where the governance might not be as strong. So, for example, the governance is made up of 3 parties only, each with 1/3 a vote, and so they have to always have 2 parties agreeing in terms of how this is done, as opposed to a CTF where the board structure might be a lot bigger. So the thing is that if you're looking to get a long-term endowment or long-term investment, then you're looking for some sort of structure that protects that capital and results in the investment from that capital flowing to conservation. However, there are other opportunities such as outcomes funds, where they will pay you for an outcome that you achieve on the ground. So, for example, if you say that you're going to improve the fishing quotas in an area and reduce bycatch, and you can measure that, there are some facilities or funds out there that might pay for that, because that might require a reduced consumption by the local communities, or reduced fishing, not consumption, but reduced pressure. And that might have an opportunity cost that the outcomes funds are willing to pay to substitute. So there are several other options. I guess it really comes down to what are you trying to finance and how? What are you trying to achieve? And that will then define the structure or the product that you should be using to finance that.
Thank you so much for that, Rowan. I think with about 10 minutes left to the webinar, I'd like to give an opportunity to 1 or 2 people in the audience to engage. I see a hand from Andrew. Andrew, let me just get to you. All right, Andrew, over to you. I've enabled your mic. Andrew, feel free to unmute. Andrew, if you're there, feel free to unmute. All right.
It says he's not able to unmute in the chat, Sipiso.
Mm-hmm. All right. Then Desiree, over to you. You can unmute your mic.
Thanks. I hope you can hear me.
Clearly. Loud and clear.
Thank you. And thanks for facilitating and the presentations. They've been very interesting as well from a Zimbabwe perspective, coming from the banking sector, leading in this process and trying to navigate this issue on CTFs. And I think my questions are around the participation of government to say what kind of structures may be legally. Are we looking at statutory instruments? Are we looking at maybe a trust deed component that speaks to insulating the fund? I'd like a bit more information on that, if possible. And I think the question around use of proceeds to say, are we able to sort of address some of the key barriers around access using a use of proceeds as a KPI to say maybe in the event of a certain park where we have governance issues, where we have the administrative issues, can we use those as use of proceeds? Maybe yes, but maybe what kind of investors do we need to look out for? Maybe that's the question for Rowan as well. But happy to be involved in this process. Thank you.
Thanks, Desire. I think that's Desire, correct? Desire, not Desire.
Sounds good.
All right. And I think, Andrew, are you still there? All right. Before we take our next question, Rowan, feel free to respond. The question is legal instruments and then use of proceeds. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So just quickly for Andrew, so he's saying that he's still muted on your side. So why don't you just check on your side? And then to answer the question from a legal structure, I think most of the times you are looking at a trust deed, so specifically, which is the wrapper in which the endowments and the like sit in. And so that would be where the board would sit and where the relevant parties would participate in terms of the governance, etc. So that would be the ideal, and it would have to then meet the local government requirements under those sort of trust deeds or similar. So yes, I think you wouldn't need to engage government per se, but you would need to understand what are the legal requirements to set up a structure such as a trust in the country that are there. And that does differ from country to country. So it's important to make sure you understand that. In terms of the use of proceeds, absolutely. So part of the trust fund's mandate would be use of proceeds and how grants are allocated to implementing partners. So that would be a significant document. It would define pretty much everything that can be financed and everything that can't. And it would also define the impacts of negative scenarios. So if somebody doesn't perform, what happens, etc. So the use of proceeds and how money is actually spent is very much part of the design process of a conservation trust fund. It's critical. It sits right at the beginning of the process, and it really, really sets out how that conservation trust fund will operate going forward. And the rest of the governance is implementing that specifically. I hope that helps.
All right, thank you. And then we'll try and take Andrew. Andrew, I've enabled your camera and mic from your end. Can you try unmuting? If that doesn't work, please try exiting and coming back into the meeting. Your settings would adjust. While we're waiting for Andrew, Lebo, please feel free to unmute on your end.
Thank you very much, Tsepiso, and everyone who participated in this. My name is Lebo. I represent Her Capital Impact Advisors. As you might have followed my comment, that Her Capital Impact Advisors was born or established out of our experience having worked with community conservation nature resource-based conservation groups, both in the Okavango Delta and the Tule Black regions. We wanted to maybe have an insight on what the programs you have in Botswana and what role can local advisory firms on the ground, ecosystem experience that we have play in partnering with you, and some of the structural gaps that you might have encountered in rolling out your mandate in Botswana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question, Lebo. We are working with partners regionally for sustainable finance work in Botswana, and we're currently working with the CASA Secretariat for sustainable finance support, which includes communities on the CASA and on the Botswana end of the CASA landscape. So we are very open to having a conversation to actors on the ground. Feel free to reach out to us, and yeah, I'll be happy to facilitate that conversation level. I'm not sure if Andrew is back. Awesome. Andrew's not back yet. So I think that concludes the end of our Q&A section. If you do have any follow-on questions, perhaps for the coalition fund, please, we will share resources after the webinar, and feel free to reach out to us. We will provide an email for you to reach out to. I think that does conclude the end of the Q&A section, and we're at the very end of today's webinar. So please, if you can, just respond to the survey on your screen. Please scan the QR code on your screen. It is a quick survey. We just would like to know what your experience has been. He has his hand. Steve, all right. I'm just going to enable your mic as well, Steve, if you'd like to engage. All right, Steve, your mic is enabled, unless that was a false hand. All right, I think that might have been a false hand. So I think with that, I'd like to take it back to Chanda. You opened for us, Chanda, and I'd like to ask you to close off the session for us. Over back to you, Chanda.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tapiso, for a great session. Ernesto, thank you for the rich insights, and Wanda, practical landing the concepts of CTF on the continent. Rowan, thank you so much as well for the content, helping us understand in quite a simple but very clear way what is possible, what is not possible, and helping us reflect. Most importantly, thank you to all the participants. Thank you for giving us 90 minutes of your time. It's not easy. We understand you have many other things to do, but you chose to spend part of your afternoon with us. We do hope that this was a fruitful conversation. This was useful. Some lessons were learned. Please do fill out the survey that's on the screen, because this helps us do these webinars better. Please also follow us on LinkedIn. And look out for our next webinar, because we have 2 more, I believe, Tapiso, if I'm correct. And also a great big thank you to GIZ, EU, SADC, and all the other partners who make our work possible. And have yourselves a great afternoon if you're on this side of the continent or world, or morning if you're a little further back in time. Thank you. Good day.